What happens when a grieving mother is abandoned by her own children at her husband's funeral? Her next decision shocks the entire family, and nothing is ever the same again. Helen Moore pressed a gloved hand to her chest, bracing against the cold wind that whipped through the cemetery's bare trees. She watched as the gray sky seemed to fold lower, its heaviness pressing against the lonely patch of grass where her husband's casket now rested. Frost clung to the wilted flowers piled on the grave. The crowd, what little there was of it, huddled near the headstone, but the one thing Helen noticed most acutely was the empty space at her side. She glanced around. Her children, Paul, Linda, and Eric, were nowhere to be found. Paul had called the night before with a hurried excuse about work meetings he couldn't miss. Linda, always quick to send a text instead of a visit, claimed her daughter was sick. Eric, the youngest, hadn't even bothered to answer her calls. Now, as the minister read the final words, Helen realized she was the only family member present for the last goodbye. The handful of old friends who attended offered quiet condolences. Mrs. Watson from next door squeezed Helen's hand, whispering, "He was a good man. I'm sorry your children couldn't be here." Helen tried to smile but could barely muster the strength. She stared at the casket, her heart heavy with grief, and something colder, abandonment. When the service ended, Helen remained beside the grave while the others drifted away. The groundskeeper hovered nearby, clearing away chairs and muttering about the weather. Helen traced her husband's name on the headstone. Arthur Moore, beloved husband and father. She thought of all the years they'd spent together. Arthur's laughter filling the kitchen, the countless family dinners, the vacations where Paul sulked, Linda read by the pool, and Eric insisted on taking charge of the camera. Arthur had adored his children. He'd worked overtime for their school fees, built a treehouse for them by hand, and forgave them every small slight. But here, at the last moment, none of them had shown up. Helen finally turned away from the grave and made her way to the waiting car. She didn't need a ride. She'd insisted on driving herself, refusing Mrs. Watson's offer for company. The silence in the car was suffocating. Helen drove home, every familiar street now seeming foreign, each tree and lamp post a reminder of what was lost. She parked in the driveway, where Arthur's old car still sat, and paused before going inside. Her house felt colder and larger than ever. She slipped off her coat and stood in the foyer, staring at the framed photographs on the wall. Smiling children. Family holidays. Helen brushed her fingers across the glass, tracing the faces of her grown children, the children who couldn't be bothered to honor their father's memory. A casserole from Mrs. Watson waited on the kitchen table, but Helen had no appetite. She poured herself a cup of tea, hands trembling, and sat by the window. Outside, the sky darkened. She tried to remember the last time they'd all been together under one roof. Christmas, perhaps, 2 years ago. Even then, they'd argued about money, politics, and who would inherit what. Helen's phone buzzed on the table. Another text, from Linda this time. Hope the service went okay. Sorry again. Call you soon. No call came. Helen looked around the empty kitchen, memories swirling with pain and bitterness. The house was full of things, antiques, silver, the old grandfather clock Arthur cherished, and the will tucked away in a locked drawer. She stood and walked through the rooms, each object a chapter of their shared life. She sat in Arthur's old chair, the seat still bearing the shape of his frame, and let herself weep. It wasn't just Arthur she was mourning, it was the family she thought she had, the one she'd spent her whole life supporting. The loneliness pressed in on all sides, sharper now than even the fresh loss of her husband. When the tears subsided, Helen straightened, her jaw set. She began to gather the condolence cards, stacking them neatly beside untouched plates of food neighbors had brought. She picked up her pen and notepad, and started a list: funeral bills, utility payments, messages to answer. Her life, it seemed, would now be lived on her own terms. The house was silent except for the old clock's steady tick. Helen watched the shadows crawl across the floor and told herself she would make it through this, somehow. As night fell, she lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling both empty and resolute. The family she'd given everything for had left her alone in her greatest moment of need. But Helen was still here. She had endured loss before. She would endure this too. The first days after Arthur's funeral passed in a strange, muffled haze. Helen woke before dawn out of habit, reaching for Arthur's hand only to find the bed cold and empty. The house, once noisy with conversation and argument, felt cavernous and brittle in its silence. Helen busied herself with the practical things. There were endless papers to sign, death certificates to send, insurance agents to call. She worked her way through Arthur's desk, sorting through his neatly labeled files, stopping now and then to stare at his careful handwriting or the old notes he'd left for her, reminders about the garden, small jokes, "Don't forget, you're the best." She placed the notes in a small wooden box, tucking them away like treasures. In the kitchen, casseroles from neighbors stacked up. Helen called to thank each one. Mrs. Watson checked in every morning, bringing fresh bread or a kind word. The postman paused to say how sorry he was for her loss. Their concern, warm as it was, only made the absence of her own children more acute. On Wednesday, Paul finally called. His voice was businesslike and rushed. "Hi, Mom. Just checking in. How are you holding up? I've got a big meeting but wanted to see if you needed anything." Helen kept her reply brief. "Thank you, Paul. I'm managing." He offered to come by next week, maybe, and hung up before she could reply. Linda sent flowers, white lilies with a pre-printed card, "Thinking of you. Love, Linda and family." Helen set them on the mantel and forced herself to admire their beauty. No visit, no call, just a silent gesture sent from a distance. Eric didn't reach out at all. Helen tried to stay busy. She cleaned, rearranged the pantry, sorted Arthur's clothes to donate. The neighbors admired her strength, remarking on how composed she seemed. Inside, though, the loneliness gnawed. Each night, Helen sat by the window with her tea, watching the streetlights flicker on and off, waiting for a sign, any sign, that her family would show up for her as she had shown up for them all their lives. Sunday brought a sharp reminder. The church bulletin listed Arthur's passing, and Mrs. Watson convinced Helen to come to service. Helen sat alone in the third pew, surrounded by familiar faces but feeling oddly exposed. Afterward, parishioners hugged her, pressed her hands, promised prayers. The pastor mentioned a meal train for Mrs. Moore as she recovers from her loss. Helen thanked them all, holding her grief close and private. That afternoon, as Helen returned home, her phone buzzed with another text, this time from Paul's wife. "Paul says you're doing okay. Let us know if you need help selling the house." Helen set the phone aside, her patience thinning. She remembered every birthday, every scraped knee, every late-night talk with her children, and could not fathom how they had become so distant, so transactional. Not one had asked how she felt. Not one had sat beside her and listened. A week after the funeral, Helen stood at the front window, watching a pair of robins dart around the bare maple tree. She realized, with a cold clarity, that she could no longer wait for her children to fill the empty space Arthur left behind. If family would not come to her, she would have to find another way to carry on. Helen washed the last of the funeral dishes, changed the sheets, and placed fresh flowers in Arthur's favorite vase. The house was hers now, hers to manage, hers to fill, hers to decide what came next. And as dusk fell, Helen locked the doors, turned off the lights, and made her way to bed alone, her mind sharp, her resolve building, and her heart learning, painfully, how to stand on its own. Days slipped by, each one measured by Helen's small routines. She swept the front porch, tended the potted geraniums Arthur once watered with care, and wrote thank-you notes to everyone who had sent flowers or food. Her handwriting was steady, each word a shield against sorrow. But grief crept in everywhere. In the faint scent of Arthur's cologne that lingered in the bedroom, in the empty spot at the dinner table, in the hush that followed the ticking of the old grandfather clock. The phone rang less and less as the condolences slowed. Once the casseroles ran out, the neighbors' check-ins grew less frequent too, their lives folding back to their normal patterns. Mrs. Watson still came by with mail and a gentle smile, but even she could not fill the emptiness that now stretched across the house. Helen opened closets, confronting the avalanche of memories tucked away in each one. She found Arthur's fishing gear, the old blue tackle box he'd refused to throw away. In the linen closet, she came upon the children's childhood quilts, Paul's faded red patchwork, Linda's yellow butterflies, Eric's bold stripes. She held each one close, remembering little arms tangled in sleep, Saturday morning cartoons, and snow days when everyone crowded together in the living room. Despite the flood of memory, Helen felt a curious detachment. She noticed how the edges of photos were curling, how dust had gathered on the trophies Paul once prized, how Eric's soccer medals still hung from a doorknob, never packed, never claimed. These objects, once cherished, now felt like relics of another world. That Saturday, Helen attempted to call Linda. The phone rang 5 times before going to voicemail. She tried Eric, but his number went straight to a generic message. She considered calling Paul, but remembered their last hurried conversation and set the phone aside, unwilling to chase down attention that should have been freely given. Instead, Helen took a walk through the neighborhood. She passed houses she'd known for decades, waving at neighbors, pausing to chat with Mrs. Patel about the weather. "You must miss Arthur so much," Mrs. Patel said softly. "The street feels different without him." Helen nodded, her throat tightening, and found herself unable to answer. Back home, Helen busied herself with paperwork. She called the bank, set up automatic payments, and gathered tax documents. At the back of the filing cabinet, she found the will she and Arthur had updated a few years earlier. The folder was thick, filled with instructions, notarized signatures, and a list of valuables in the house. Helen read it slowly, tracing Arthur's careful check marks. His handwriting was everywhere, steady and reassuring, reminding her of the man who had never let her down. As she worked, Helen noticed a pattern. Nearly every page bore the names of her children, lines written with hope and trust. She felt the sting of disappointment sharpen into something steadier. She wondered, not for the first time, how people could change so much and so quietly. That evening, Mrs. Watson invited Helen over for tea. The two women talked about everything but funerals and family. Mrs. Watson showed Helen her latest knitting project, and together they laughed over small neighborhood gossip. Helen cherished the easy company, the warmth of a friendship that needed no explanation. Returning home, Helen passed by the mantel and paused at the family photos. She saw her children at every age, smiling, hugging, posing beside Arthur. She stood for a long time, eyes tracing each face, until she finally reached out and turned a single picture frame face down. As darkness settled outside, Helen realized she could not control how others showed love, but she could decide how to move forward. She finished the night by making herself a cup of cocoa, writing in her journal, and folding Arthur's old flannel shirt to keep on the pillow beside her. In the stillness, Helen's loneliness transformed into something else, a quiet, unspoken resolve to honor herself as fiercely as she had honored her family all these years. Helen woke to a shaft of bright sunlight slicing across the bedroom. She spent a few minutes listening to the birds outside, the house otherwise silent except for the creaks of settling wood. Arthur's flannel shirt lay folded on the opposite pillow, a silent comfort. Helen pressed her hand to it before getting up. The day stretched ahead, empty of obligation. Helen took her time with breakfast, tea, a boiled egg, a single piece of toast, then set about cleaning the house. Dusting, vacuuming, opening curtains to let in the fresh spring air. She paused at each window, looking out at gardens waking up after winter, neighbors tending their lawns, children riding bikes down the street. She filled a basket with clothes and set out for the local thrift shop, a habit she and Arthur had shared for years. The shop owner, Mrs. Reeves, greeted Helen with a sympathetic hug. "It must be hard, clearing out his things," she said, accepting the bundle of Arthur's sweaters. Helen nodded, her throat tight. "Hard, but necessary. I want them to be used, not boxed away forever." After the shop, Helen walked to the bank to deposit a small check, a condolence gift from a distant cousin. The teller, recognizing her, offered gentle words of sympathy. Helen thanked her and left, surprised at how simple kindnesses could sting as much as soothe. At home, Helen tackled the attic, a job she'd put off for months. She found boxes labeled in Arthur's careful script: Christmas lights, Helen's keepsakes, Paul, college, Linda, childhood books, Eric, trophies. She opened each, sorting the contents into piles. Keep, donate, ask the children. She placed a call to Paul, left a message: "If you want any of your things from the attic, let me know." She texted Linda a photo of her old books, and sent Eric a picture of his trophies, asking if he wanted them saved. The responses trickled in. Paul would try to swing by sometime. Linda texted a curt, "No, just donate," and Eric didn't answer at all. Helen gathered a box of old photographs and spent the afternoon at the kitchen table, sorting through the decades, birthdays, graduations, summer vacations. She smiled at some, cried at others, then set a stack aside for Mrs. Watson, who had always loved sharing memories of neighborhood parties. Late in the afternoon, Helen heard a knock at the door. Mrs. Watson stood outside, holding a small vase of daffodils. "Thought you could use a bit of sunshine," she said. Helen invited her in for tea, grateful for the company. They talked for an hour, laughing about Arthur's stubbornness and Mrs. Watson's attempts to teach her cat new tricks. For a while, Helen felt almost herself again, whole, instead of hollowed out. When Mrs. Watson left, Helen prepared a simple dinner, then sat with her tea by the window, watching twilight settle over the street. Her phone remained silent, the children distant, the world outside spinning on without her. Before bed, Helen took Arthur's shirt from the pillow and held it close. She whispered good night, knowing he would have comforted her, would have understood. She realized, with a pang, that her strength now had to come from within. That night, she made a decision. She would stop waiting for her children's calls, stop measuring her worth by their attention. She would fill her days as she chose, seeking company where it was freely offered, and keeping her heart open only to those who showed up for her. As Helen turned out the lights, she felt a small, quiet victory. In the deep silence, she claimed the space she had always given to others, and for the first time in a long while, she slept soundly through the night. Helen awoke refreshed, her dreams filled with color instead of grief. For the first time in weeks, she rose without the usual heaviness. After breakfast, she set out for the farmer's market, a woven bag on her arm. The streets buzzed with early summer energy, neighbors tending flower beds, children shrieking as they chased each other past the bakery. At the market, Helen stopped at each stall, greeting vendors by name. She bought fresh strawberries and a loaf of sourdough, then lingered over a display of handmade candles. Mrs. Tran, the candlemaker, pressed a lavender one into her hand. "A gift," she said with a gentle smile. "For peaceful nights." Helen thanked her and tucked it into her bag, feeling the warmth of small kindnesses. On her way home, Helen passed the library and decided on a whim to step inside. The librarian, a soft-spoken man named Daniel, smiled in recognition. "Mrs. Moore, we just got a new shipment of mystery novels. Would you like to take a look?" Helen spent a happy hour browsing, leaving with 3 books tucked under her arm. Back at home, she arranged the flowers Mrs. Watson had brought in a vase, set her market finds on the counter, and sat down with her first book and a cup of tea. The sun drifted through the window, warming the kitchen as she lost herself in a story. For the first time in months, her mind wandered somewhere other than the past. As the days passed, Helen carved out a new rhythm. She joined Mrs. Watson for weekly walks and learned to bake bread for Mrs. Tran, who invited her over for lessons. At church, she volunteered to organize the annual charity sale, sorting donations and chatting with other volunteers over lemonade and cookies. Her hands found work, and her heart began to open to new people, small moments of joy. One afternoon, Paul called with his usual abruptness, asking if she'd had a chance to clear out any valuables from the house yet. Helen replied evenly, "I'm taking my time. There's no rush." Linda sent a brief email about selling her old bike online, and Eric, as always, remained silent. Helen felt the sting, but it faded quickly now. The people who showed up in her life weren't the ones she'd expected, but they were kind, attentive, and present. She realized that her worth was not measured by the attention of her children, but by the company she kept and the life she chose to lead each day. That Saturday, Helen hosted a small gathering for her neighbors, tea and cake on the back patio, laughter spilling into the garden. Mrs. Watson recounted stories from her youth, Daniel the librarian talked about his cat's latest mischief, and Mrs. Tran taught everyone how to braid bread. As evening fell, Helen sat in the soft twilight, listening to the hum of happy voices and the gentle chime of Arthur's windbell in the breeze. The ache of loneliness was still there, but softer now, woven into a new kind of belonging. Before bed, she wrote in her journal, "Today I felt seen. Not for what I can give, but for who I am." Helen placed the lavender candle by her bedside, lit it, and let its calming scent fill the room. She breathed deeply, feeling Arthur's spirit beside her, and drifted to sleep with gratitude in her heart. Summer brought a welcome energy to the neighborhood. Helen embraced each day with intention, saying yes to invitations and new experiences. She was asked to help plan the block's 4th of July picnic, and for the first time, she accepted without hesitation. Planning committee meetings filled her afternoons. She found herself laughing over logistics, swapping recipes, and learning the stories of neighbors she'd never truly known before. On the day of the picnic, Helen arrived early to help set up tables and string banners across the park. She wore a blue dress Arthur had always liked, pinned with a small red poppy at the collar. As she placed homemade pies beside Mrs. Tran's bread and Daniel's brownies, Helen felt a pleasant buzz of anticipation. The afternoon unfolded in a whirl of laughter, games, and music. Children raced through the grass with sparklers, neighbors competed in three-legged races, and the air was sweet with the scent of barbecue. Helen organized the raffle and ran the lemonade stand, greeting every guest with a warm smile. When dusk fell, she sat on a picnic blanket surrounded by friends, Mrs. Watson, Daniel, Mrs. Tran, and others, watching fireworks burst in color over the rooftops. As the crowd applauded, Helen's phone buzzed. It was a message from Paul. "Hope you're doing okay. Haven't heard from you about Dad's tools. Let me know when I can come get them." Helen stared at the screen for a moment, then tucked the phone away. She'd answer in her own time, if at all. The next morning, Helen returned home with leftover pies and a heart full of gratitude. She tidied up, humming as she worked, and later took a walk to the community garden. The flowers she and Mrs. Watson had planted in spring now bloomed in vibrant rows, and Helen knelt to pull a few weeds, content in the rhythm of simple tasks. She bumped into Daniel, who invited her to join the new book club at the library. Helen agreed, happy for another reason to gather with people who valued her company. As they strolled back together, Daniel remarked, "It's wonderful to see you so involved, Helen. The neighborhood's brighter with you in it." That evening, Helen received a letter in the mail, an invitation from her church to help organize a mentorship program for local teens. She smiled, seeing in these invitations a recognition she hadn't expected. Her world was expanding, not shrinking, and the roots she was growing ran deep. Helen finished the day writing postcards to her sister and to Mrs. Reeves at the thrift shop. She poured herself a glass of lemonade and sat on the porch as the sun set, feeling the warmth of friendship and the satisfaction of a life being lived on her own terms. She realized she hadn't thought about her children's absence for days at a time now. When she did, it was with acceptance, not anger. She would no longer wait for what was never offered. Instead, she chose each day to surround herself with those who cared. As night fell, Helen whispered a quiet thank you to Arthur, to her friends, and to herself for the courage to build a life anew. By late summer, Helen's calendar was dotted with new routines. Tuesdays were for volunteering at the library's reading program, where she delighted in helping children sound out stories, just as she'd once done with her own. Thursdays meant baking bread with Mrs. Tran, filling the kitchen with laughter and the scent of yeast and sugar. Sundays were for quiet walks to church, where Helen was no longer a background figure but an active, appreciated member of the congregation. The book club became a highlight of her week. Each meeting brought lively conversation, shared recipes, and easy camaraderie. Helen's insights were valued, and she found herself forming real friendships, people who called just to check in, who invited her to dinner, who shared both troubles and joys. One warm Friday, Helen hosted a small dinner for her new circle of friends. She served Arthur's favorite stew, fresh bread, and a crisp apple tart. Laughter filled her home, and the dining room glowed with candlelight and the gentle buzz of voices. As the meal ended, Mrs. Watson raised her glass. "To Helen, who proves it's never too late to find family." Helen's eyes stung with happy tears. For the first time since Arthur's passing, she felt genuinely surrounded, by love, by kindness, by true belonging. No one asked her for anything but her company, and she gave it freely. Her children, meanwhile, remained at a distance. Paul sent occasional texts, mostly about the house or estate. Linda wrote infrequent, practical emails. Eric was silent. Helen responded politely but offered little beyond what was necessary. The ache was still there, but she understood now that her children's absence was a reflection of their own choices, not her worth. One evening after the book club, Daniel walked Helen home. As they reached her front gate, he paused. "You know, Helen, you've made such a difference in our little community. You bring people together." Helen smiled, touched. "I never imagined I'd start over at my age. But I'm glad I did." Daniel nodded. "Arthur would be proud of you." Helen looked up at the stars. "I hope so. I finally learned that family isn't just who you're born to. It's who stands by you, at your table, in your life." That night, as Helen tidied the dishes and watered her geraniums, she marveled at the strength she'd found. Her loneliness had become the soil for new connections. She saw clearly now that she was not, and never would be, truly alone. Before bed, she wrote in her journal, "Some losses carve out space for something unexpected to grow. I am grateful for every blossom." Helen slept deeply, comforted by the voices and laughter that lingered in her home. Autumn arrived in a flurry of gold and crimson leaves. Helen's world, once so empty, was now full, her calendar inked with invitations, her house bright with laughter, her heart steadied by genuine connection. She felt Arthur's presence in every joyful moment, his love guiding her through a life she'd rebuilt on her own terms. As the days shortened, Helen received a letter from Paul. He was blunt. "Mom, it's time we talked about selling the house and dividing Dad's things. Let us know when we can come by." Helen read the letter at her kitchen table, sunlight pouring across Arthur's old coffee mug, her new friend's notes tucked around the vase of autumn flowers. She folded the letter and set it aside. In the following weeks, Paul and Linda's requests became more persistent. Emails about the estate, messages about what's fair, phone calls she let go to voicemail. Helen answered with short, polite replies, offering no more than she wished to give. She continued to live fully, hosting dinners, volunteering, sharing walks with Mrs. Watson, planning a short trip with Mrs. Tran to visit a nearby historic town. One crisp Saturday morning, Helen sat with Mrs. Watson, reviewing paperwork and laughing over old neighborhood tales. When Mrs. Watson noticed a legal folder on the table, Helen smiled. "I'm updating my will. 4 years, I did everything for my children, even when they gave nothing in return. Now, I want to thank those who stood by me when I needed family the most." With her lawyer's help, Helen drafted a new will. She left the house to charity, designating funds for the library, the community garden, and scholarships for the children's reading program she loved. Small bequests went to Mrs. Watson, Mrs. Tran, Daniel, and others who had shown her true kindness. Her children received what was legally required, and nothing more. Weeks later, Helen hosted a celebration, her new chapter party. Friends filled her home, toasting her courage and joy. Arthur's old wind bell chimed on the porch, a reminder of everything she had survived and everything she had chosen for herself. Winter crept in, gentle but unyielding. Helen lived each day with intention, reading by the fire, joining church suppers, planning small adventures. Her heart felt full, her conscience clear. She cherished the community that had embraced her, and she gave her love where it was returned. When the time finally came to share her decisions, Helen met her children at the house. She listened patiently to their grievances, answered their questions, and stood her ground. No anger, just quiet certainty. "You left me alone when I needed you most. I learned that family is more than blood. My legacy will reflect the love I actually received." Helen walked them to the door, closed it gently behind them, and turned to find Mrs. Watson waiting in the kitchen with warm tea. That night, Helen wrote in her journal, "Grief is not the end, but the beginning of knowing your own worth. I chose kindness, for myself and for those who showed it in return. That is the legacy I leave behind." As the first snow fell, Helen sat by the window, heart at peace, knowing she had honored both Arthur's memory and her own. She had finally chosen herself, and in doing so, found everything she truly needed.